Boy, oh boy, here we are. I am pleased as punch to be here. This is going to be a good conversation. I already got a stack of chats who are jazzed at what's going on inside. I've heard even a couple people say this is going to be a good one, if you can believe it. I am here with some very esteemed guests. Many of them I've spoken to before on my show, Blood Satellite, and a couple new faces. One new face to be precise, but I'm so glad that he's here, Greg Wyclyffe. I'm going to shout them out first to make sure I get it out of the way. Look, who do we got here? Who's on our dais? We got Paul Fahrenheidt, founding member of the Old Glory Club, author of the Fahrenheidt Family Archives on Substack. Who we got beside him? We got Fortissax. Everyone knows if at Fortissax on X, an author of Fortissax is typing on Substack. You just saw him there a second ago, Greg Wyclyffe, Canadian man extraordinaire. SaveFreeSpeech.ca. Got to go there right now and check it out. And he's at GDub on X. And last but certainly not least, Endeavour. You know, one of my earlier interviews. Who doesn't love Endeavour? You can find Royal Endeavour on X and Endeavour on YouTube. Search him up. Co-host of Classic Movies with Morgoth. Morgoth, one of everyone's favorite people. Enough said. Okay, let's get right into it. We're not going to take up your whole evening tonight, folks. We're just going to have a real fun rip-roaring time. What's the topic? The topic is the Canadian annexation by the United States of America. Now, we got a good diversity of voices here. We got some people who are pro-annexation, some people who are against it, and we're going to hear the reasons for and against. And I know Fortissax, you had even published a Substack as recently as today on this topic, gearing up for the talk, kind of laying out your entire argument.
Yes.
Now, I'm not going to just throw to people. We can kind of just get started with whoever, perhaps you or Paul can say. Maybe we start with Paul, actually. I would love to hear a position on why Canada ought to be annexed, in so many words, by America.
Well, the question of whether Canada should be annexed by the United States is not a new one. As a matter of fact, it has existed as long as the United States as a polity separate from Great Britain has existed, all the way back until Benedict Arnold's failed expedition into Quebec during the Revolutionary War. Canada was attempted to be brought alongside the other 13 English colonies in the Americas as an additional member of declaring independence from the British, and the Canadians chose not to do that. And the history worked out in such a way that Canada remained separate from the United States, remained a dominion of the British, and after the war, as Mr. Fortissax pointed out in his article, many of the loyalists, the Anglo-loyalists in the 13 colonies, resettled in Canada. And so in terms of historical self-conception, America became what it became, and Canada became a sort of reflection of it, the path that wasn't taken. Canada has an existence prior to loyalists resettling there. However, loyalists resettling there became an inarguable part of its identity. But that basically the whole point of me extrapolating that is to let all of you know that this is a question that has been above the heads of these two tribes for the entirety of their existence. To directly answer the question, though, as to the case as to why the United States should annex Canada, I don't feel very strongly on the issue. What I do feel very strongly about is the national security of the United States. It may become necessary in order to maintain the national security of the United States for the United States to annex Canada. Why do I say this? I say this because the Canadian government has proven wholly ineffective at preventing infiltration of its government institutions, including its military, by foreign actors. This is China. This is also Russia and other various geopolitical opponents of the United States. India is not necessarily an actor. They're not really I don't really consider them a country. They're more of Anyway, I'm not going to go into that. But
Speaking of which, I just covered unrelated. I covered the book Camp of the Saints by Jean Raspail with a good friend T.R. Hudson. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So the point is, Canada has the longest coastline on planet Earth. Counting all of the islands, counting, it's largely unguarded areas. And at this moment, Canada is an obstruction to the territorial integrity of the United States. The state of Alaska is kept geographically separate from the lower 48 states by the existence of Canada. All Alaskans do not have a land connection to the lower 48 of the United States by the existence of Canada. That is, and there's more I could go into on that. I'm not going to talk about economics because everyone knows economics, and everyone knows the economic arguments, and economics doesn't motivate anyone to do anything. At least in discussions like this, LBJ once said, and I know we all hate him, me too, but it's a pretty good quote. LBJ once said that talking about economics is like pissing down your leg. It seems hot to you, but never to anyone else. And so that's completely leaving aside the Canadians aspect of this. In terms of a pure power politics perspective, I could start getting into the power disparities between Canada and the United States and how Canada's continued sovereignty is at the pleasure of the United States. But
here, that's going to be a good one in a second. Let's
Whose
hold
fault
on to
is
that. Let's put a pin in that. I wanted to also say,
that's my conclusion, basically.
I'm going to stake out, because I don't want this to seem like a gang up. I don't want to seem like poor little Paul Fahrenheidt up in here. I'm going to actually make a case that is perhaps not as direct, but more on the side of annexation or perhaps geopolitical realities. I was actually on an interview recently with my friend Jason Miranchuk of Miranchuk Now, and he, as a Canadian living in Australia, he was very passionate that Canada seemingly deserves to be annexed. And I hate using that word annex because when you say annex, it sounds militaristic, whereas what Trump and many others have been talking about. Right now, I've got Wikipedia pulled up, and I'm just scrolling through movements for the annexation of Canada to the United States ever since 1837. That's kind of what I wanted to start with, just to frame this very loosely, was that a lot of people thought we were having this panel, because of something Trump said, because it was a political flashpoint and everyone was memeing on it for a long time. In fact, it was actually somewhat difficult to find Americans there's more Canadians I found who are pro annexation than Americans, even the ones who were joking about it. They were just memeing around. Fine, well and good. But I wanted to just say that it seems that this has been a discussion that's been going on politically, at least my entire adult life. A good friend of mine by the name of Laughing Man, he runs the Sunflower Society. He was referencing his political science courses when he was in university by saying that, this is the main reason we have NORAD, which was to prove that Canada has the ability to project its force internally to secure this term that I've been hearing my entire adult life, which is Arctic sovereignty. That's in the news quite a bit. In fact, I did have a couple of references here. Let's just pull this up. Canada looks to reinforce Arctic sovereignty through diplomacy, military, says Minister. Like, it's been talked about for generations. And so Trump recently talked about, well, Canada needs to pull its weight, do this or that. That's going to be a topic of discussion probably after Trump, and as it was before Trump, and the fact that it's a recurring conversation made it relevant to me. That's why I was doing this, because it ain't just a meme. It's not just a little bit of controversy we want to have. There's actually a real discussion to be had here. But it touches on a lot of things. It touches about what is Canadian identity. It touches that manifest destiny from the American perspective. Is America's national security at risk? I'll throw you a couple bones there. And we've discussed this extensively on Blood Satellite, my show, and on Vanguardist Journal, where I write, and other people have talked about it as well. Sam Cooper is an amazing voice in Canada, talking about the infiltration from the Chinese Communist Party, especially on the West Coast. Losing, I don't need to go into a huge diatribe about that, but when people talk about infiltration through India, China is a very serious political one, and also controlling the majority of the fentanyl trade in North America. That's something that America might be concerned about. And let me just say this, I don't think Trump was serious about wanting to annex Canada by making Canada the 51st state, as he put it. And there's even a clip here. Let me just pull this up just to show what I'm talking about. This, if people can hear this, I think.
I would love to see Canada be the 51st state. The Canadian citizens, if that happened, would get a very big tax cut, tremendous tax cut, because they're very highly taxed. And you wouldn't have to worry about military. You wouldn't have to worry about many of the things. You'd have better health coverage. You'd have much better health coverage. So I think the people.
A lot of people latched on to the health coverage thing, but if he were serious, in my opinion, he wouldn't talk about making Canada the 51st state. He would actually talk about making Alberta the 51st state, Alberta and Saskatchewan, and then discombobulating the entire Commonwealth from that, like attacking each province if he were strategizing about that. So that's my position by saying that there is a legitimate conversation to be had about this issue. It's not just a meme. So whoever wants to jump in and respond to these 2 points or go off on your position, feel free.
So there's a lot to touch on here. And to Paul's credit, I also agree with him, and he's going to be hard-pressed to find any Canadian who disagrees with him. Arctic sovereignty is a serious issue. I remember a couple of years ago, Obama and Harper having a spat over who owns the Northwest Passage and who has more or less exclusive rights to sail through that area. Namely because the Russians and the Chinese were allegedly claiming territory on the seafloor, or trying to, given that it was international waters, so on and so forth. So from the purely realpolitik, geopolitical perspective, yeah, I agree with that 110%. Most Canadians want a stronger military. The military has been a sinking ship for the last 20 years. The military has had insane retention problems for 20 years. Most Canadian veterans will tell you that. That is an open secret. 75% of the Canadian military is logistics. It's not actually combat-ready fighting forces capable of projecting force or even defending their own territorial sovereignty. You can blame previous Liberal and Conservative governments for gutting the military. Mainly, if I recall correctly, that goes back to Pierre Trudeau when he downsized the military and merged them into the modern Canadian Armed Forces, destroying centuries of tradition for the Air Force, the Navy, Royal Canadian Air Force, the Royal Canadian Navy, and the Canadian Army. So 75% of the Canadian military is also bad. No, he's not kidding. So Nathan Rake has an interesting comment in there, which is that 75% of the Canadian military is also obese. Yes, it is. I would not be surprised if that is the case, although I would counterweight that with the US and say that 70% of young Americans are not fit for military service, whether by mental illness or physical incapability. So there you have it. Nobody really has an optimal fighting force. So many things to touch upon here. We've already covered the divergence between Canada and the United States. Yes, 100%, it's true. You did see a divergence a little bit before 1776. In the 1750s, you had early waves of loyalists from Massachusetts going up into Nova Scotia. New England planters in particular, they set up shop there. About half of them returned home, but then that would form as the foundation of the base for where most of these loyalists would come from. Two waves of approximately 60,000 loyalists from New England and the surrounding areas. Some say also Virginia, the Old Dominion. There were a lot of Southerners of the United States, many of them high Anglican, who were actually quite loyal. In fact, the British overestimated their support in the southern states because of this. So you did see a massive wave of 60,000 in two waves. You have very early loyalists, you have the main bulk of them in the 1770s to 1790s, and then you have later loyalists who set up shop in southern Quebec. Now, it is pertinent to say that this divergence did breed a different nation entirely, because as I had argued in the article I published yesterday, what you saw also was a social selection. You saw a social selection for traditionalist conservatism and not liberalism. The ideological motivations for Canadians not wanting to be part of the secular liberal republic of the United States was mainly that they were loyal to tradition and to the principles of Anglican theologian Richard Hooker, and also on the French case of people like Joseph de Maistre. So from the very onset, Canadians are a traditionalist reactionary people. They are not liberals. The entire foundation of the state of Canada that would only emerge in 1867 was rooted in this philosophical difference. And it led to two completely different paths. One of them, and I know this is going to piss off the Americans, one of them was basically a proposition nation, a very early form of a proposition nation. When they decided with the 1790 Naturalization Act that citizenship would be free to all white men of good character, they started opening their borders to all 63 nations in Europe. Slowly but surely, and although Calvin Coolidge would maintain the preference for Western and Northern European immigrants until the Hart-Scheller Act, actually, what seems to be the case is this slowly started to include everybody into the United States. And by the 1860s, as I cover in this article as well, to recuperate from the losses of Anglo-Americans from the American Civil War, they flooded the country. The movie Gangs of New York is literally about this. It's about Bill the Butcher, who was an ethnic Anglo-American nationalist, fighting what he saw was an invasion of the savage hordes, namely Irish Catholics. Nowadays, we understand that the Irish Catholics are white, at least I hope. But back then, this was a serious issue. And what ended up happening was that the Anglo-Americans who founded the United States, who wrote the Constitution of the United States, who wrote the First and Second Amendments that most Canadians love and know and love, and some of them want, is a product of them, a unique people entirely. So what happens is these Anglo-Americans are demographically displaced in their own country, with the exception of Utah and Upper New England and some of the Midwest, and some of the English Cavaliers in the southern southeast states. So H.P. Lovecraft in the early 1900s was already loading a demographic decline of Native Americans. And the term Native American is important because it used to not mean the indigenous. It used to mean Anglo-American. It used to mean somebody of a British extraction who founded that country, right? So from the very onset, although you see tradcons today like Orrin McIntyre, you see James Kirkpatrick, although I like him very much, you see many of these other commentators, Charles Haywood, talking about America and nation, they're still trapped in the same dialectic loop of liberalism, which is they can't define what an American is because they don't even share a European ethnicity from coast to coast. They don't. They have no conception of it. And my theory, as I had written about previously, was they turn to racial nationalism to cope with that fact because they have no underlying commonalities. Italian Americans are different from German Americans. People have pointed out that Tim Walz, although he is obviously a European American, is very characteristically different from people in New England or people from the South. Paul himself is an Appalachian. There are differences between Appalachians and Southerners, right? Most people don't know that. They think everybody in the Southern U.S. is the same, but they're not. So right off the bat, there's already
I
many.
would correct you. I am not an Appalachian. I am from the Piedmont of Virginia. I would be closer to what you would call a Southerner than someone who is Appalachian.
Okay. Somebody told me in the Blood Satellite chat that you were Appalachian. So right off the bat, there's already many of these differences. And then when you start to look at the demographic situation of the US, which I also covered, 47% of the entire US population within the next 5 years is going to be European American. Most of them seniors. Canada has a demographic edge, mostly in Eastern Canada, but Canada has the demographic edge, with approximately 63% estimated within the next 5 to 10 years being European Canadian, mainly of British and French extraction. And to me, this is very important because I identified that nations are peoples, they're not propositions, they're not abstractions, they're not nations of ideas. An ethnos generates an ethos. An ethos from an ethnos can rebuild, it can build things, right? When you don't have that in the United States and your demographics are not in your favor, and the vast majority of the inhabitants do not support the First and Second Amendment, statistically they don't, and I'm taking this from the US Census, 2020 US Census, there's just, I'm really not seeing the benefit. Now, to Trump's credit, and I'll end on this for the time being, to Trump's credit, the only thing Canadians could conceivably benefit from a merger with the United States is a tax cut. That's effectively it. The First and Second Amendment are relatively irrelevant in the Canadian context. And we can touch upon that later, but I'd like to let someone know.
Thank you so much for that, Fortissax. Thank you for everyone, including myself, who's spoken so far. But I want to throw to either Greg or Endeavour. There's a lot that's been covered so far. So take your time and state your piece however long you want to take.
All right, I guess I'll go next. So why am I opposed to annexation? Why do I not want Canada to be part of the United States? First and foremost, because I consider Canada to be its own unique, independent country with an identity separate from that of the United States. I myself, I don't identify with the United States, with the Constitution, with 1776 or republicanism. I identify with loyalism and with the British Empire and with Anglo-Canadian heritage. We have a history of our own, and that's something which we have developed over hundreds of years. And ultimately, that is what ultimately that's what's my motivation to do what I'm doing. It's to preserve that. And to just accept Canada to be absorbed into the United States would be throwing that away for the most part. Secondly, I don't see any practical reason for it. So how is this actually going to benefit Canada? So like Fortissax has already mentioned, this would actually make Canada less white. Canada, of course, we have our own problems. We're not necessarily we're not necessarily going to be winning any saving the white race competitions anytime soon. But when you look at the demographics between the United States and Canada, Canada still is slightly more white. And again, it even has slightly more what would be considered heritage Canadians, that being Anglo-Canadians and French Canadians. So it doesn't help us in that regard. It just would further enslave us to global homo. So I think the goal ultimately would have to be to break off from this big globalist system. And I would say from the perspective of Americans, it would seem to make a lot more sense to want independence from Washington. If you actually value your history, if you actually, and from your perspective, of course, it's slightly different. I have nothing against Americans and them identifying with their own history and their own culture and their own people. But if that's what actually matters to you, you should want to separate from this system, which is trying to destroy that, not bring more territories into that. And I'm even content that Canada might have to break, certain parts of Canada might have to break off in the future. That may be the case. And I don't see that. I'm not buying any of these supposed benefits. Like, oh, we'll get the First and Second Amendment. Well, again, I don't see that as worth it to throw away our entire nationhood, which we've spent hundreds of years building. And it's not even like the American government really even respects the rights of their own citizens. So why on earth would we expect that it's going to help us in Canada? I don't think it will. And in terms of things like military alliances and security, well, the United States is also quite infiltrated. Let's not forget the Zionist lobby and how much influence they have. They basically control all of America's foreign policy and a good deal of the domestic policy as well. I just think that Canada needs to solve its own problems, and I don't feel like we need to that we need Donald Trump to take over our country to solve it. Are we so impotent that we just need some strong man from south of the border to come in and save us? Well, I don't think that we should think of ourselves as these hopeless damsels in distress who are just so impotent and so helpless that we need someone abroad. We need to throw away our entire history of independence, loyalism, of the crown, and throw away everything which actually we identify with, to have some strong man to come in and save us when it remains to be seen whether he's actually going to do that in the United States. Now, I think so far Trump has done some decent things for the US, and I'm happy for Americans. I hope that they do get the benefit. But at the same time, there are some issues. So Trump isn't redefining the United States as a country for European Americans. He's a civic nationalist. He's done some good work on illegal immigration. He still has a lot more to do on that. But it's not like we can't do this ourselves in Canada. So even the Liberal Party, as cucked and treasonous as they are, they've actually walked back on some of their more insane policies in the past couple of months. So Canada's now taking action to reduce temporary foreign residents, like and it's begrudgingly. So it's not like I think someone like Trudeau or the Liberal Party have actually had a change of heart or anything, but it's reality is creeping up on them, and they realize that they've created this disaster. So I think we're probably already going to get a lot of the benefits of what I called in my video, America's Thermidorian reaction, that being the United States kind of reeling in some of the more radical aspects of the last 10 years since the Great Awakening. So it's not going back to the pre-1965. It's not going back to before the revolutions of the 1960s, at least not yet. But they are trying to reel in some of the more radical aspects. We're already seeing signs of that happening in Canada. So I don't think we're actually going to get much of a benefit at all. And maybe the biggest thing would be taxes. But again, that just seems so shallow. That seems to be such a shallow proposition to just throw away your country's sovereignty. Now, I know Canada's not exactly a sovereign country. I mean, we're dominated by these crazy anti-white libtards, by Zionists, by Jews, by Chinese, Indians, and all these other groups are basically dominating Canada right now, and the actual heritage Canadians. Well, we don't really have very real representation, but I don't think we're going to get that by even further enslaving ourselves to globalism. So that's why I'm opposed to Canada being part of the U.S.
Now, Greg, we would love to hear from you. Again, a lot's been covered, but feel free to speak your mind.
Yeah, so a lot of good points have been brought up, and I've been following politics for some time now, so I'm most kind of concerned with like what is practical, what makes sense, like what is important, because respectfully, I feel like a lot of these conversations kind of get caught up in sort of the nitty gritty or the details, and I'm very happy to be learning about some history here because I'm not a history buff by any means. I'm not a buff when it comes to like the founding documents of America and all this type of stuff. However, I say all that because a lot of the conversation surrounding this topic reminds me of PPC pub nights. What's that? Well, when I first joined the PPC, I would go to these pub nights. Okay. And I realized I didn't go to them very long because I realized they would always kind of descend into these conversations of like, well, this is the best system to run society. This is the best system to run society. Well, actually, it would be great. And it's all this very sort of like optimistic, if I had the power, this is what would be good for society. And I feel like a lot of the conversation is like that surrounding this. It's like, well, if America came in, we would have this good thing and that good thing and this great thing and that great thing. And it's like, well, guys, we don't have, same thing with the PPC pub nights. It's like, we don't have any political power at all. None of us have any power, and we're not near any levers of power. We can't do anything. And even more so in this sort of niche of where this conversation right now is happening, which is, I mean this in a loving way, political autists, right? Like if you follow politics in Canada, you're a minority. Like if you actually follow what's happening in politics, especially in Canada, you are certainly a minority. Most people get their politics through like Instagram. It's very passive. It's very casual. And I'm seeing a lot of the people who I really liked what Endeavour said there of like, what are we, damsels in distress? And all of a sudden Trump is going to like swoop in and save us. And it's crazy how many patriots, like Canadian lovers, are just like, yes, let's actually just become America. That'll solve all of our problems. And it reminds me of the simplicity of people who just want to vote for Polyev. Like that'll solve all of our problems. Oh, Trump coming in, that'll solve all of our problems. And the fact of the matter is that like there is so many variables to how this would happen. And every time I hear someone say it, oh, it would obviously be 10. We would be 10 states, of course. Would we? What? Because Trump is a aggressive businessman. We are coming to the table. If this moves forward, we are coming to the table with like not very good negotiators. I wouldn't think. Who's going to negotiate for us? Ottawa bureaucrats? And you don't think we're going to get fucked over in this transaction? We could become a territory with very little voting power. Because let's face it, Trump wants territory, resources, and maybe to some extent, what would you call it? Us as consumers, I guess. But like let's not get it twisted here. Like like Trump has a very intentional reason of why he would want to take over Canada and its territory and resources. Just so you guys didn't realize, that has nothing to do with the well-being of Canadians, the priorities of Canadians. And so yeah, and of course that's what first comes to mind for me, is all of this sort of optimistic thinking of how we could get all these things. And it's like, well, what's the flip side of that? It could be really, really bad, actually, if we go the other way. That all that being said, I think it's a huge gift from Trump that he's doing this. Personally, I think it's more of like a lot of talk. It's more of like a negotiation tactic, and it's obviously super effective. Everybody is talking about it, but it's a huge gift, I think, for people like us, because it's activating Canadians. I got a normie talking to me today of like, wow, our country's so fucked. Are we going to become part of America? And it's like a very sort of activating thing where it's like, our leaders are terrible. Like it's very clear to like normal people, like how much of a mess this country is. And I think there's opportunity there to try and leverage that in a positive direction. However, a lot of the right-wing people are sort of, from what I've seen, and I'm not speaking to anybody specifically on this chat here, but like I've seen some of it on Twitter. Someone was like posting how, again, we'll be 10 states. There's all these great things. And I don't even necessarily disagree with any of that, but why I think it's like an issue is, like, for me, the activating moment needs to be about how apolitical and apathetic Canadians are. Like, that is the problem that I've been trying to solve and trying to address ever since I joined politics, however many years it was ago now, which is Canadians don't care about their own country. Canadians do not get off the couch to do anything. And sure, there's a lot of fat Americans who don't care either, but there is a difference. There is a difference where Americans treat their politics like a sport. Americans have this autonomy of my freedom, my constitution. We don't have that here in Canada. And that's why I find it's so ironic, or I don't know if it's ironic or whatever, but there's all these people, these Canadian right-wingers who are like, yeah, we'll get all the benefits of the American Constitution. It's like, well, you need a population of people who want to enforce the Constitution for the Constitution to mean anything. You know what I mean? So if we have Canadians still living in Canada, but now it's America, we're still going to have a whole bunch of apathetic people here who don't care to put pressure on the politicians, don't care to actually engage. Like, all of a sudden, once we become American, we're going to have all the people living here like suddenly start to give a shit about politics. Because if you look at the problems in our country, it's coming from a lack of civic engagement. It's coming from a sort of lack of intense political participation. We're getting outmaneuvered by, the World Sikh organization. Sikhs who are like alien to the, historic makeup of Canada, and they're infiltrating our political institutions, all types of the trucking industry, you name it. They're outmaneuvering us and taking over our institutions. And, until more Canadians start to fight back and start to give a shit and start to try and claw their way into politics and start caring, I don't see how, the problem is going to be solved. Because if we just become America, how do those problems just go away? Isn't it just going to be like a new sort of system, just with the same people participating in it? Like, if someone can answer that question, I don't know. Because, another sort of totally naive part of the conversation of people wanting to be annexed is like they actually believe that American bureaucrats, like everyone in Ottawa is going to be fired or something. And like all the Ottawa bureaucrats are just going to go away or something. Like all these corrupt pieces of shit who only care about their pensions are suddenly just going to be like, a bunch of American patriots are going to come in and just remove them out of office. And then here's the thing. And now what? Now American patriots are going to be ruling our institutions. Like, is that good? Is that better? How do we know? Like, why is it so much better to be ruled over by Washington, D.C. than it is Ottawa?
It's not.
There's a great comment here by Lee Stewie. All the Maple MAGA-tars have never once attended a town hall or city council meeting. And that touches on something you were just saying there, Greg, and something I was even talking to Mr. Fahrenheidt before the stream, which is the simple question of, what hypothetically, I know we're all internet guys talking about this, but what actually would be in it for America? And there's a case to be made for resources and Arctic sovereignty and whatnot. But I think we'd already discussed that. Would Canadian patriots love the Constitution? Would they fight? Would they die for the American Constitution? Probably not. So like what actually would be gained? And but that reveals an interesting phenomena in Canada, something that I've been trying to fight against for much of my adult life. I know Fortissax and many other Canadian nationalist types do this, which is that it seems that no matter what, even now, Canada seems to define its vigor by reaction to America and what is to be done about that. Like, look how many Canadian patriots have appeared the moment mean American said something, liberal, conservative, all kinds of different ideologies. But that's how Canada has been defining itself most of my life. The Canadian identity is we're not Americans. We're more, this is what the liberals would say, but even the conservatives, when I was young, we're more engaged, we're more enlightened, we're not brash, we're not Jerry Springer country like those fucking Americans. But I'm like, at no point have we generated our own distinct identity, and that presents certain problems. However, we need to answer that question, because even now it seems that, look at what Trump did, and look at what a few talking heads did, threw the entire nation into discombobulation. We have it is preposterous that we're talking about this, but who else is talking about it? Mayors throughout the fucking country. Politicians are talking about this in Canada as if it's serious. They're joking about it, but tariffs aren't fucking around. There's actual consequences to these things. And look what a few words were able to do to discombobulate the entire nation and to cause this electrical surge of patriotism. However, is not generated from within. And I think therein lies the problem. And it seems, just to Greg's point, that Canadians broadly, aside from all our friends, are not ready to even have a serious conversation about what a Canadian is, except something that is opposed to America. Any thoughts on that?
So I've got a few, and there's a few contextual and very important things to mention here. Firstly, I don't agree with the framing that our reaction to the States in this situation or in the past is a liberal phenomenon, because it's not. It was hijacked by the liberals in the 60s. That is a primordial instinct in Canadians that goes back to the very founding. It goes back to the very, very beginning of Canadians' existence as a people, and it was rooted in real things that mattered, such as republicanism, the crown, God, king, and country, so on and so forth, our very philosophical foundation. So there's a part of that there.
Just for clarity, I was talking more recently, not in the past as well.
No, you're absolutely right. And the other thing is, the reason I would argue, the reason you don't see so much political participation is purely the diversity. And you can actually scale this with how diverse a society is. You can scale that with how high trust the society is. The more diverse the society, the less high trust it is. The less civic participation there is. The less engagement with political systems and communities there is. So that is it could be argued that that's a side effect of that. It's a side effect of the multicultural post-national implementation. If nobody feels like they're represented, except for the people who are attempting to exploit the nation and its mechanisms in government, then what do you have, right? You have nothing.
Great point. Any other thoughts on, I guess we're getting something called the nature of identity. And you had actually, Fortissax, you had a couple of questions that came through previously. One, I'm trying to look for it here, but it was the question of whether you specifically, in your mind, the Canadian identity would include Eastern Europeans, Italians, maybe other European immigrants. When people talk about mass migration or immigration, they tend to think of, India, China. However, Canada's history with mass migration was also from Europe, and it caused a lot of controversy at the time, all through the 20th century. So in your opinion, on the topic of Canadian identity, would that include Italians, Ukrainians, and the like?
I know you addressed that to Fortissax, but let's cut right to the heart of the issue. The largest structural problem with the Canadians, with the Canadian identity, with the whole concept of a Canada, is that it is founded upon attempting to make two separate nations with two separate languages, two separate confessional heritages, two separate histories, that genocided each other on the Canadian landmass, attempting to take that and to forge that into one coherent identity. That is the greatest structural problem with Canada, is this pretension, this idea that you can make Anglo-Canadians and Quebecois one nation, as though they are one people, as though the Battle of the Plains of Abraham didn't happen.
We did, though.
You did not. It is
We
failing.
did.
You did not.
It's failing now, but and what did you do? You created a proposition nation and wiped your own founders off the planet. So
you don't know anything about the founding of the United States.
First of all,
you know nothing about the founding of the United States. You know
Wait,
nothing.
wait,
about
I'd say that
didn't America implicate black slaves into their like national identity though?
That's arguable, but some people make that argument.
But I mean, okay,
I
first
just
of all,
don't think it's that's. I feel like this is kind of just picking something from history and being like, that's why you're not a real nation. And it's like, well, that's one example. And it was one that certainly defines us. But yeah, I don't know.
The requirement of bilingual status of all people in government is a massive waste of energy. No nation that has attempted it before has succeeded in the long run. You cannot buck two ethnoses with two. The specific
what
thing
about
here is more
Switzerland?
The specific thing here is more so two languages, not so much two different ethnicities. It's two languages. Language can overcome a great deal.
You said that people genocided each other. I mean, yes. Sure, there was a fight between them, but I mean, comparatively, it was pretty mild. Like there hasn't even been any.
The Acadians ceased to exist. The entirety of Nova Scotia was a French colony that was removed.
So I just looked it up. In Swiss Parliament, its debates are held in German and French majority. Is Switzerland a real nation to you, or
is Canada Switzerland? Is Canada's
situation but dude, you're saying like definitively you can't have a nation if there's two different languages. Like
you cannot have a nation if there's two different languages. Switzerland is a negation zone. Switzerland. The joke is that if you go to the Swiss cantons, they can't tell you who the president is. Switzerland is not so much a federal entity. That's exactly what it defines itself against. It's a confederation. That's what Switzerland is. It's not a real nation in the sense that it's a federal entity.
I think the large geographic landmass, I think, is the larger challenge for Canada because it is so large, it is so vast, and I think that is a one of the challenges that we have to overcome. A great example is it's not just English and French; it's Alberta hates Quebec, Quebec hates Alberta.
Sure,
I wouldn't disagree that like this weird. Glass ceiling of needing to be bilingual and this weird sort of a Laurentian elite, this intersection of Ottawa between Ontario and Quebec. Most certainly. You see it even in the political scandals with like SNC-Lavalin, all these like weird gangsters between Ottawa and Montreal just fucking jerking each other off and filling each other's pockets. Absolutely. But I think you're kind of jumping the gun there to say that that's why you guys can't be a country anymore.
I didn't. You put words in my mouth. I didn't say you cannot be a country. I said that is the greatest structural problem with Canada as a nation, is that it is attempting to be two things at once.
There is an interesting thought pattern there, which is: is this Commonwealth of Canada possible long term, or is it inevitable that it will eventually cleave along the line of Anglophone and Francophone?
So I'm gonna point out three different things, and to your credit, Dimes, you actually made a pointed point not too long ago. I believe it was on your discussion with Marinchuk, where you said that core to the Canadian identity has always been this push and pull between ethnic Anglo-Canadians and French Canadians. And I think that there's something to that. I think that they work as forces in some ways that stabilize each other and remind them of who they are. And they also keep each other in check. And historically, this has always been the case, as a matter of fact. Now, to the point as well, the founders of Confederation in 1867, a great many of them were Francophone. They were actually pro-Anglo Francophones. Not too long ago, a couple days ago, I posted a number of quotes from a number of those fathers of Confederation. And also, we are a confederation. We're a confederal entity, or rather, we're a federation, but we're modeled on a confederal model. So we do have a great deal of decentralization. The provinces are nominally, in some ways, more independent than U.S. states are, but in other ways, U.S. states are more independent than Canadian provinces are. So there is a great deal of decentralization, and there's always been a tension between the unitary character of Canadians. We are inherently authoritarian. We pretend that we're not. We pretend that we're liberals. We've made liberalism our ideology since the 60s. The fact of the matter is that it's not in our character. It's not in our temperament. The evidence of this is in how we treat gun laws and free speech and property rights. Technically, we have no property rights or rights to private property. We have the right to own guns, but we have severe restrictions. We might have free speech and freedom of expression, but we also have limitations on that with hate speech. So yeah, that's 100% true. On the fundamental differences between the English or the Anglo-Canadians and the French Canadians, they united and formed a country on the basis of their rejection of liberal ideas. That was the unifying force. The French viewed themselves as the last bastion of the Ancien regime. And of course, the Anglo-Canadians were loyalists, and they had that in common. And what you did see in Canada's early history was a lot of early religious crossovers, a lot of intermarriages. My own family comes from this. So while there was tension, yes, the Acadians were deported. What you didn't mention, and perhaps you didn't know this, many people don't know this to your credit, the Acadians were actually invited back. That's why New Brunswick is the only officially bilingual province in the country, because they were invited back, and they actually pretty much run the entirety of northern New Brunswick. So they are there to this day. Conversely, the Cajuns who went down to Louisiana disappeared. They were assimilated and they were turned into a tourist attraction. But so we did manage to make this experiment work for 230 years, really until the 1960s, when the communists subverted the sovereigntist movements of Quebec.
Well, the other point is that the reason it kind of works is because French Canadians have their own unique part of the country. So it's not like all of the country is like 70% Anglo-Canadian and 30% French Canadian, at least historically. Well, they were concentrated in Quebec, so they had their own kind of polity where they could have their own where Quebecois culture is dominant, and then outside of that, Anglo-Canadian culture is dominant everywhere else. So, in terms of local politics, you didn't really have that. That really wasn't as much of an issue. It seems like it's more of a federal thing. But getting back to the point of the discussion, though, how on earth is us joining the United States going to actually solve any of these problems for Canada or for the U.S.? If Canada has a problem with having French Canadians and Anglo Canadians, well, the U.S. has that problem times 10 with the issue with the founding stock of America, then the blacks, the Irish, the Italians, and now Hispanics and everyone else who has come since then. So with Canada, we now have the problem with Indians and Chinese and Muslims, whoever else you want to throw in there, native Canadians. But I just don't see how, if the big problem here is the lack of homogeneity, which I agree that this is the problem, that it is the ultimate problem is with this idea of multiculturalism and the idea that you can just slot any person into any kind of system, and if they just have the right values, then it's going to work. And this is an idea which basically comes from the U.S. I'm not saying I blame Americans for Canada adopting this idea, but the United States was very influential on both Canada and Europe in adopting this idea of the proposition nation. How on earth is Canada going to actually solve this problem by becoming a U.S. state? That's just going to make it the whole thing worse.
I just want to piggyback on that point, more so from the Canadian perspective, right? Because a lot of the Canadians that think becoming America will be better, it's like, well, it's not like there's going to be a huge migration of different peoples. And in Ottawa, the problem has been that it's not Canadian interests first. It's the interests of lobbyists. It's the interests of foreign special interest groups that have infiltrated the institutions in Ottawa. And then on top of that, it's Quebec interests seems to be able to bully people around in Ottawa to make final decisions. And then on top of that, it'll be, American interests right on top of all of that as if everything else below that would go away. It's like, no, it would just make everything even more complicated. And for those, if you forgot, Canadian interest is at the very bottom of that totem pole.
Well,
So
and let's remember our elite theory here. All right, the Quebecois self-conceive as a group separate from the rest of Canada, even if they conceive of themselves as a group within Canada. I completely agree with the point. They're not a majority. They're generally concentrated in one area, but they are an organized minority within Canada at the expense of the majority, which is Anglo-Canadians, and they very much push government policy to favor their specific province over other provinces. This is why you cannot have a bilingual state, because one will be the majority, one will be the minority. The organized minority will utilize its power, will utilize its influence to push around the majority. This is how it works. This is how elite theory works. And this has been a problem with Canada. And more so, its hijacking is largely due to the Quebecois. All right. I'm not here to blame them or to cast anything on their feet as a people. Right. I'm not here to claim that the Canadians aren't a people. They clearly are. The Quebecois clearly are. All right. And I'm not even really here to sell to Canadians the annexation of Canada by the United States. Frankly, I don't really want it to happen. All right, I don't care. I think the juice isn't worth the squeeze for the United States. But the problem is the point I am making is that if that decision comes and that decision does occur, Canada doesn't get a say into whether it happens. Canada doesn't decide whether the United States will annex or not. The United States decides that. And I'm not saying that as like a rah, America is great and, you Canadians are just so tiny and puny, et cetera. But no, what manpower can you put in the field? What domestic military industry do you have? What food production do you have? What oil do you have? Yes, you have it in Alberta, but you have to bring it all the way across Canada to Ottawa, where the large concentration of your military infrastructure is. The point is, and what I came on here, I didn't come on here to sell America annexing Canada. I came on here to sell to you Canadians that you must look at the state of your country right now. You must understand the failures that have occurred, and you cannot blame America for it. You cannot blame America for it. You've done it to yourselves.
I'm certainly not blaming
who's blaming America for it?
No, I'm not saying you all gentlemen are, but many Canadians do. Many Canadians blame America for the state of their problems, just as many Europeans blame America for the state of their problems. Many of these decisions are domestic decisions made by Canadian politicians.
And also, if I can just jump in there I just want to jump in there because I'm going to let you guys go off in a second, but just to make sure that I sort of build into Paul's point there is a conversation to be had about whether or not this is inevitable, this annexation. So remove it from the morality of it, remove it from anything that we think ought to happen. If we look at it from sort of a neo-realist approach of just pure geopolitics, if there are resources in Canada that are not being exploited, many Canadians would agree on this, and if there is a credible national security threat, doesn't matter what it is, let's just say it is it inevitable that if Canada cannot exert its own sovereignty against these forces, and it seems to affect America, will someone step in? Because, I always think back to, what's his fucking name? Anyway, is this idea that sovereignty isn't a status, it is a space to be occupied, that if you cannot control your land, someone will inevitably step into it. And if America, if Canada becomes a void and it's federal government, nothing of the Canadian people, if the lateral unity between the provinces cannot maintain and there's a void of sovereignty, it will either be America or Russia or China. One of them will be, through geopolitical forces, forced to step in. Now, that's a side conversation. Just wanted to build that into Paul's. Now everyone else can continue.
So there's a third player here that nobody's mentioning, and that's the EU, which I also do think is a viable option. I'm surprised nobody has mentioned that because the French government, the French foreign minister, is offering the Danish currently a small garrison of an expeditionary troops in Greenland. I'm not sure what the intent of that is. Maybe it's just a show of force. Maybe it's just to, show support for their fellow European Union member. But it's not looking like the European vassals of the American Empire are too content being bullied in this kind of way.
And also, just to build that point, when I was speaking to Jason Miranchuk on his show, he's a big proponent of this theory of international politics that I don't subscribe to, but I find it interesting. I'm looking into it, that the Bank of England and the City of London is really the key holder to all world events, and that so many economic crises pull back to them, and that it is the Bank of England and the City of London that is opening up the Canadian theater in a war with America. And then, there's other, add that to the UN. And another, we were talking about this, Fortissax, before the show even. We were speaking of the last referendum in Canada, and we were talking of, I think it was on with Benjamin Boyce. We were talking about equalization payments that are made to Quebec from other provinces, saying, well, if Canada falls, who the fuck is going to support Quebec? And you had correctly said that at the time of the last referendum, I believe France would have been a player there as well.
So if I'm remembering correctly, Jacques Parizeau managed to get the support or guaranteed support of the French and a number of other Francophone countries. They were prepared that if the vote was a yes, that they were going to immediately recognize Quebec as a sovereign nation, so that there was no way for the federal government to back out, and if basically forcing them to allow them to leave. So that is a possibility. The EU also has substantial ties in Montreal. This is something people don't realize. There are a number of European subsidiaries or just directly European branch offices to a number of companies located in Montreal. Montreal is the gateway between North America and Europe, not just culturally, or historically, but also economically. That connection is there. And it's also through the French Canadians themselves, most of whom are bilingual, and they sort of act as the gateway peoples between Europe and the North American continent. Obviously, this follows the broader theme of Canada being a mix between the old world and the new, not just from the French, but that's just how we've always been. We've always been this crossroads, this weird, curious crossroads between the two continents. So I see, especially, I'm not convinced that the Russians are going to be a key player in the near future. I think it's obvious now that the Chinese are eclipsing them. I think that it's more that the Russians will be vassalized by the Chinese, or at least have a arm's length partnership with them where the Chinese are the superior partner. I don't believe that the Russians are going to be projecting force in the Arctic anytime soon. I think the bigger issue is the Chinese. That being said, with that gap being filled, and if you remember a couple of years ago, Germany now has the 4th highest military budget on the planet. But that's dependent, and whether or not they use it against the Russians or American enemies is dependent on how long the Americans can keep them on their chain. Because as many people were pointing out when this was occurring, and the European vassals were increasing their military budgets, will European nations with bigger militaries respect their previous alliances now that they have the ability to project force, now that they have the ability to shake off whoever is calling the shots, right? That's something people are not asking questions for. So no, and also, are they going to be libtarded forever? I don't think so. I think you're seeing some very significant political shifts in the European continent right now. Macron's government is failing. The FN were extremely popular in the last European Parliament elections. The Germans are swinging far to the right. The third biggest party is the AfD. If I'm not mistaken, they may be second soon. So that is a shifting landscape entirely. Sweden is already succeeding at remigrating some people. They keep increasing the amount of money they're paying to migrants to get them to leave, which has proven to be a mixed strategy, but there seems to be some success on that front. So for how much longer is the EU just simply going to take orders from the UN or from the Washington DC elite? I'm not so sure. I would sooner see a European and Canadian coalition than Canada be annexed or further integrated with the United States, given its socioeconomic circumstances.
The problem with throwing in with the EU is they are not a power. They don't have commodities. They don't have domestic military industry. They don't have the agricultural base. They don't have oil. They don't have any of these other things which a modern 21st century military requires. The EU's independence, if it were to be independent, it would be a regional power at best. It cannot force project into Canada. And in addition, if Canada were to throw in with a theoretically independent EU of the United States, or to throw in with Russia to join, or China, another geopolitical lobby, that immediately becomes a casus belli for the United States to invade. Don't you understand this? If Canada throws in with another lobby, then then annexation becomes a reality and not a theoretical discussion we're having. So, Canada's continued nominal sovereignty, as we're saying here, Canada's continued nominal sovereignty right, is possible. And I believe that the best way to do that is for Canadians to look and address their own domestic issues at the moment. And Mr. Wyclyffe makes a very excellent point in the sense that being absorbed by the United States will not solve the problems of Canada. It's not a magic fix-all. All right, these, you would just have the same problems under a different system. That said, you all need to be aware of your position. You all need to be aware of the realities of the resources and the lack thereof, the infrastructure and the lack thereof that you have. You are very much a second-rate power. You do not have force projection capability right now. That may change in the future, but that is the reality, and that is what I'm here to bring.
Well, okay, but why can't we just then have some kind of alliance with the United States? Canada and the U.S. have been allies for a very long time. Why can't they
That's how things are right now.
I mean, sure. I mean, I'm fine with Canada being an ally of the United States. I think it would be foolish for us not to be. However, I just don't think that our internal politics and our national identity should become American. I don't think we should become a U.S. state. I mean, I'm totally fine with aligning our geopolitical interests with the United States if we're going to assume that the United States actually were not as Zionist occupied as it is now. If there were a United States which were actually dominated by European Americans, I would be okay with a Canada dominated by European Canadians being in an alliance with that. I just don't support the idea that we just need to be absorbed into that union in the way that we would give up our internal governance and basically give away your entire any vestiges of sovereignty you have left. I'm not claiming that Canada is exactly a sovereign country today, but I mean, I just don't think that the answer is to just even further embed us into this kind of big globalist system. And to address something earlier, the idea that Canadians blame Americans. Well, I don't blame America, or certainly not Americans, for the state of Canada. Now, I think it's true that many of the worst ideas in Canada today originated in the United States. But I certainly don't blame European Americans for that, because most of the people were Jews who made these ideas. So they didn't have anything to do with it. And it was the Canadian ruling elite.
Including, mind you, propositional nation, which didn't pre-exist the 1950s as a term used. Continue.
Well, okay, so I don't blame Americans for this, and I don't even really blame America, because it was Canadian leaders who imbibed these ideas and decided to implement them into our country. So the idea, I mean, I can recognize where the ideas came from. I can recognize that they're poisonous. I can recognize that they didn't work in the United States and they aren't going to work in Canada either. They haven't worked in Canada. But I would say the response needs to be that, instead of this idea that, well, we should just allow this strong man in because he's going to save us. Well, I think that Canada needs to fix itself. So with the libtards, when Trump says that he wants to take over Canada and turn it into the 51st state, their response is to squeal and to double down on their gayness and to say that, oh, we're not Americans. We're going to burn down the White House. Yeah, I don't believe in this idea.
Remember when we did that?
Yeah, doubling down on. Yeah, so what the libtards are doing is doubling down on their gayness and whining about how much of a meanie Donald Trump is being, and how it's literally Hitler. It's like he's doing what Putin did to Ukraine. Oh, he's doing what Hitler did to Czechoslovakia and Poland. Oh, he's so no. What we need to do is be a serious country ourselves again. There was this photo from a couple days ago on Twitter. It showed a picture of Trump Jr., RFK, Musk, and a few other guys on Trump's private jet, beside a picture of these Scandinavian prime ministers sitting around this table as if they were I don't know, it was like parent-teacher night or something like that, and they got together to discuss their teenage daughter's book project on Gone Girl or something like that. It looked pathetic. It was for leaders of countries who just exuded this utter weakness, and they seem to take pride in the idea that they're portraying themselves as losers. I'm not trying to have a go at Scandinavia here, because it's the exact same with Canada. I mean, someone like Justin Trudeau and his party have made a point to portray themselves as cucked and as weak as possible. And it's been like that for decades. I mean, Canadian identity has been for a long time the opposition to the United States, that is something which defining ourselves in opposition to the U.S. is not something which I don't know. That's something which has happened for centuries, but I don't think it's always been a bad thing. The problem is that since the 1960s, it's been to be more libtarded than the United States. So the response to someone like Trump, it should be that, well, we should actually be something respectable again, because, a billionaire flying on his private jet, president of the most powerful country in the world, best friends with the richest man in the world. I can understand why they don't respect someone like Justin Trudeau. I can understand why they don't respect these Scandinavian leaders who are, who portray themselves as if they're middle school teachers. When Trump just sees that and he says, well, I'm going to go take Greenland, and what are they going to do about it? I'm going to take Canada. Well, what are they going to do about it? Well, the point is that we actually need to be a serious country again, and one that people actually can respect. And it starts with actually taking yourself seriously and getting out of this like globo homo, John Lennon's imagined fairy tale, which we've been living under for the last several decades. I mean, the leader of the Canadian Armed Forces, she looks like some like dried up hippie from 1969 or something like that. I mean, it's an absolute joke. The Canadian military is a joke. I remember a couple of years ago when I was 22, 23, I was actually considering joining the military. But then just when I even just saw the pamphlets they had, the training course, the courses they had, and like the kind of people that were involved, I just thought, like, this is a joke. I don't want to be involved in this anti-white, cucked institution. Why would I degrade myself to such a degree? The point is that Canada needs to be we need to be a serious country again. If we don't want someone like Trump to bully us around, we actually have to exude some kind of force. Now, I understand we're not going to be a global power, but there's room for cooperation. We are a mid-level power. I mean, Canada's not nothing. It's still a significant country on the world stage. But if we're going to be taken seriously again, then we can actually have this mutual relationship where the United States and Canada can be allies in a world where a power like China is rising. It comes down to us actually being a serious country.
And the capability. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Greg.
I was going to change the subject a bit, so you can go ahead if you want.
I was just going to say, before we go on to something else, and the thing is, and what's very important for Canadians to understand is that the capacity to do this is there. In the First and Second World War, we had one of the largest volunteer armies in human history. Something like 1 or 2 million Canadians willingly signed up voluntarily. We didn't even need a draft for most of the conflict because Canadians just willingly did it. Canadians' military history is extremely prominent. We've always been crazy good in military endeavors at home and abroad, especially punching way above our weight, not just punching way above our weight because of our low population size. Canada at the end of World War II did have the 4th largest navy in the world. We did have nuclear power. We did have the ability to make ICBMs and nuclear weapons. And what we did instead was invested that technology into civilian nuclear reactors. We invested in the CANDU reactor. We invested in the Alouette satellite. We were the 3rd nation after the US and the USSR to launch the first human-made satellite into space. We built the Avro, right? So a lot of that ingenuity, a lot of that inner strength is still there. The capacity to be a middle power is there. It's latent within Canadians. So all of what we're talking about is certainly possible.
Yeah, and I think that it's an apt analogy that's been said many times before, but it's like, Canada is like the younger brother to the States. Paul, like I don't think there's any Canadians who are like, we're tougher, we're stronger than the United States. I don't know if that's ever happened, but the problem right now is that Canada has become so it has dishonored itself to such a degree that the younger brother is now wearing a dress with makeup on. And, America's like, what the fuck, Canada? Like, what the fuck have you done? Like, you're pathetic. Like, what is going on here? But I wanted to, I need to get going here soon, but I wanted to talk about the whole anti-Americanism thing, because I think that's very, very apt for this discussion. And also I was writing a Substack all about this topic. And essentially, I think that it's always been somewhat of a defining characteristic for Canada, obviously, because of our history being right next to you guys and the war and all that. But I think in the more modern times recently, like since the 60s, it has become a rejection of nationalism itself. Like we or at least like maybe I'm just speaking from my own experience, but whenever I think of being anti-American, which is something that I grew up with, I thought, oh, those stupid fat Americans, and they they have all of their fireworks, and they're so pompous and proud of themselves. America, we're the best, blah blah blah. And I'm like, we're not like that. We're not pompous. We're not excitable. We're not patriotic. Like that's what that anti-Americanism that I grew up with was about. It wasn't just about not being loudmouth or not being proud, but it was also like not even being patriotic and rejecting patriotism. So by being anti-American, like in my experience growing up in Canada, it was throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It was throwing out patriotism with all of that as well. I'm not proud of my country like Americans. I'm just a humble doormat for the third world. Like this is what this turned into. And I think that is why it's, it has killed our nationalism. The anti-Americanism became almost like the tip of the spear. Maybe that's not the best analogy for this, but
No,
it was like maybe like the poison in the well, rather, of evaporating any sense of national identity. It gave way for Trudeau to be, because Trump was around at the same time. Orange man bad. We are Canada. We're welcoming. We are, progressive values, and that's it. But I mean, we can touch this topic, but I do have to get going. The other thing I wanted to say, just to kind of bring it back to some practicality and talk about like the threats of globalism and all this shit. Paul was absolutely correct when he's like, it's not up to you. It's out of your control. It could just happen. It won't be up to us. We won't have a say. Like it'll be like a decision that's made from the halls of power in Washington, D.C. if this does play out. Or even Fortissax was giving the example of, the European Union or what have you, or maybe it's Russia or something like this, or maybe the Khalistani cell expands enough to take over Canada, and now we're going to be in a second state of India. That'd be horrible. But my point in all this is like, once again, bringing it back to the practicality. If you're in Europe, if you're German, if you're American, if you're a Canadian citizen, at the end of the day, the problem is, can we trust the people leading us? Because if I was an American, I would be very concerned about the effect of AIPAC, the effect of, Israeli influence on American politicians and the halls of power. And that is reflected in Canada with especially the Conservative Party. If you didn't know, if you didn't know, Paul, the leader of the Conservative Party said that Iran is a genocidal state and it would be a gift to humanity if Israel bombed Iran. So wouldn't it be interesting if they did annex Canada and we became one nation, and this whole nation of the United States Union, or the United America Union with Canada now, also supports everything Israel is doing? Like, AIPAC just consolidated its power in all of North America. And it's kind of been said already, but this is kind of like really like low IQ Alex Jones stuff, but it's like the globalists want to unionize all the countries and make it a one world government. And, I know that American patriots will say no, but it will be different because it'll be led by America. And it's like, well, if it's all still America, it comes down to who is near the levers of power, who is in control, who is making the decisions. And if you have everything coming from the same central location, it's still the same effect as a one world government, and actually kind of back to the original point. One of the main concerns as well of just becoming part of America is we have a lot of Democrat voters here. Most of our population are in these big city centers. Like, I don't know who's going to do the gerrymandering of like determining all of this stuff, but it's like, hey, yeah, Trump helped us become America. Okay, there's a lot of brown liberal people here, and guess what? We're going to vote in Mr. Beast tranny in like 2036, and now we're going to get rid of all gun law. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's a fucking worst globalist nightmare you could imagine.
And I think you all sort of flatter yourselves by assuming you would immediately have voting rights upon annexation.
No, I agree with you.
Mind you, that like the majority of U.S. states
3/5, Paul.
the majority of U.S. states were territories for many years prior to actually gaining voting rights in Congress. You know, they were territories. I'm no friend of APAC. Like I feel like that's so trite that I don't need to like state that. Like obviously, like I'm not trying to point at the mote in my brother's eye here. I'm just, you know, like that's what I'm here for. Anyway, continue, Mr. Wyclyffe.
No, Greg, I mean, you were right. It's funny hearing this from the populace because they think that they're going to get favorable terms. And the example I like to give is, you know, you take a province, and I'm not throwing shade on any of our Western Canadians here. You know, I love you guys. I have much respect for Alberta. But a landlocked province that is barely 5 million people, that is already underrepresented in the Confederation, jumping into a country of 330 million people and becoming a safe oil state, much like Montana or Idaho, is not going to be really well represented in that situation either. And the idea that any of the provinces would be organized into states and given full states' rights and not a frozen shithole like basically frozen Puerto Rico is just complete nonsense. Like there's absolutely no not to mention, as Greg touched on, you know, the jostling around this would cause in the electoral college is insane. Like they're not going to want to upset that balance of power by giving Canadians voting rights. Like it's absurd to think that we'll be anything more than a resource territory, you know, any more than a resource extraction economy than we currently are, right?
I just got one last point before ducking out here to kind of jump on that, which is, you know, normies are so frustrating, like people who don't follow politics, because they have such a naive worldview, right? And what I'm getting at here is that at the end of the day, you constantly in politics, you can't constantly have this struggle for power, for resources, and different people, different factions, different countries, governments are going to be warring over that, right? And so this, you know, giving the example of Alberta, if only they get annexed, you know, is Alberta going to be happy? Is Canada going to be happy? At the end of the day, folks, we have bullies in suits who represent either corporate interests or foreign special interests or what have you. And they are the ones who are going to be at the negotiating table. They're going to be the ones who are pushing for what they want. Is it going to be for the American people, or is it going to be for, you know, the oil tycoons? And I guess at the end of the day, like I try to bring it back to this when we have these conversations, because I feel like we can get so like high-minded. And it's like, well, let's bring it back down to reality here. Like how are the actual people going to get what, you know, represented properly? Because I think, like, you know, in any scenario, if it's the EU, if it's America, we're still facing the same problems. And that's kind of why I try to bring it back to that. But thanks a lot for having me on, guys.
I was going to give a quick shout out. Make sure people check out savefreespeech.ca and follow him on X right here to find out more. Great account to follow. One of my favorite people, Greg. It was fantastic having you on. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much. And the trailer for the documentary I'm making at the Hate Network is going to be coming out very soon. So stay tuned.
All right. Now we can keep going, everyone. I did have a question. So, and I know we're not going to go too much longer. I don't think. I know everyone's very busy. But just to bring this back to the realm of unwarranted speculation. One argument in favor of annexation, and this was put forward by Peter Zeihan, amongst others, was pointing out that each province has a stronger trade relationship south of the border than horizontally. That for a commonwealth, it seems to have more of a good relationship with America. Tariffs aside, could that financial relationship be exploited? And I'd mentioned at the top, one scenario could be don't go after Canada, don't go through the federal government, go through the provincial governments. And I know that I've spoken to many listeners on the show on the practicality, not of one wide-reaching Canadian unified nationalism, but sort of dealing more with what we're talking about here, which is identifying the permanence of these Anglo and French nationalisms, and perhaps trying to harness the dialectical nature of that. It would be a different sort of nationalism than what was expressed by Adrian Hastings in The Construction of Nationhood, which the nation is just the highest form of complexity that has evolved from the community up through the tribe, up through the city-state, up until the nation. But there is a internal coherence, and perhaps an internal coherence that Canada lacks, to Paul's point. However, if we were encouraging something like even provincial nationalism, which is what a lot of people feel like, the Albertans have sort of a nationalism form, as do the Quebecois. Ontario, not so much, but maybe. Could that also be exploited to, again, discombobulate and disrupt the sort of not propositional nature of Canada, but the federalized nature of Canada? You see what I'm saying? Like, could these smaller identity-based nationalisms be exploited, or do we need to try and create this broad Canadian nationalism, which is ironically what that flag that everybody hates was trying to accomplish? I know that was like, maybe that didn't sound like a question I was putting to everyone else. Do you think that sort of the lack of unity between the provinces could be exploited by America?
Absolutely. As many Western separatists, no, I won't start with that. Many advocates of Western Canada, despite the fact that they share a lot of similarity with the East, a lot more than they think they do. If you look at the history of Anthony Henday, he was the first European explorer along the Saskatchewan River. He was an employee of the Hudson Bay Company, and he managed to explore that territory at a record that nobody else beat at the time for how fast he managed to do it. He, being an employee of the Hudson Bay Company, founded by two French guys in service of King Henry of England, Alberta has a much deeper history than it likes to pretend. It's not all cattle ranching and cowboys. It's actually Mounties. The first cowboys out west were Mounties. They were the King's lawmen. They were not cowboys and rebels. Although a not insignificant amount of Midwestern Americans migrated into the prairies during the Klondike Gold Rush, as well as the scramble to settle the prairies, because free land was being given out, was being handed out. That being said, over the last 100 years in particular, they've forgotten much of their identity. Perhaps you might even say that they're the most rootless of the provinces. And in terms of whether or not the United States can impact the culture or even exploit that difference, I would say that they already are and they already have. If you remember, there was a party, it didn't go anywhere, and I'm not quite sure who was supporting it, but there was a party that seemed to be astroturfed called Alberta for USA. And this party managed to show up very conspicuously after the Albertans were thinking of trying to sell their oil on the international market rather than through the United States, almost as if the Americans didn't want any competition, which wouldn't surprise me at all. That's just power politics. So I would say they already have. There are also weird ties with Ernest Manning and Evan being a televangelist, and if I'm recalling correctly, the CIA, something to do with U.S. intelligence and their own strains of Christianity are curiously American in their denominations compared to what Eastern Canada was historically, which was primarily Anglican and Catholic. But this was all 100 years ago. So I would say that they already have. They've already interfered historically. They have interfered. Nobody knows why and the exact reasons why the Avro Arrow was canceled. Some say the Avro Arrow project was infiltrated by the Soviets. There's some evidence for that. Some say the Americans threatened the Canadian government. You know what I mean? And oddly enough, there's reason to believe this in some respects, because we lost 7,000 aerospace engineers who went on to work for General Motors, General Electric, and the U.S. Air Force. So who knows? There's something to that. Could they exploit the various nationalisms in this country? Yes, or the various regionalisms in the country to their benefit. Absolutely, they already have. Like there's there's no doubt about that.
It's funny you had mentioned I just got the National Post pulled up here, and I remember now that we'd covered this on Blood Satellite, the Alberta 51 project, and we looked into it, and I think it was just one guy in his like trailer in Alberta. I don't even think he lived in Alberta. That was the fucking thing. I think he was born in Alberta. And
so like Jason Myronchuk, who doesn't live in Canada, advocating for our annexation.
Yeah, he moved to like Ohio or some shit like that, and then it was just a weird, convoluted thing. But there are examples of this. Good point. But how seriously can they be taken? And if anyone else has any thoughts on that, whether or not, and this is just my scheme for how this could play out, because I do take this topic somewhat seriously, because I do think there's historical precedent to. Yeah, sorry, continue.
Yeah, so if it's possible that a complete annexation won't occur of Canada,
Yes, I agree with that.
It's more likely, if any annexation were to occur, the United States would more than likely just absorb the western provinces, British Columbia, Alberta. So I don't know if we would grab Saskatchewan, but and I think that would be twofold. Number one, to create a land connection with Alaska, and number two, it would be to grab the Albertan crude, because I don't know if anyone here is familiar with the petroleum industry. I'm somewhat familiar with the petroleum industry. The United States pulls a lot of oil out of the ground out of West Texas, particularly. That's our large oil producing area right now. We pull it out in other places as well. The thing about Albertan crude, all right, so there's different types of crude oil, right? There's lighter grades and there's heavier grades. Lighter grades is made for more consumer grade gasoline for automobiles, and the heavier grades is for commercial stuff. That we're talking boat fuel, we're talking airline fuel, things like that. So heavier grades of crude are a lot more important to the functioning of a 21st century economy than lighter grades. And so Canada in Alberta has most of its crude up there is that heavier grade, which the United States does not currently have access to a large number of. This is what the Keystone Pipeline was meant to do, was meant to have a large amount of access for that Albertan crude. And that is, push comes to shove, that is the United States' primary national security concern with Canada, is access to those heavier grades of crude oil. And that's why, as Mr. Fortissax pointed out, there is so much American intelligence involvement and power political involvement within particularly Western Canada, not only because there's that ethnic history that can be exploited by American intelligence agencies. There's also just it's sort of a perfect storm to oppose it to the rest of Canada. So yeah, I mean, that's more likely than not. And it may not even be an outright annexation. We may just recognize Alberta and British Columbia or wherever else as an independent nation from Canada, and you split it up. That's sort of my opinion on the whole thing.
So I was going to say that BC. I'll just quickly.
Go
I'll
ahead.
quickly interject here. The thing about BC, and the reason why I think that BC might also be a target, is because I think that the U.S. intelligence agencies are not going to allow a Chinese stronghold on the North American continent, which Vancouver very much is. As Dimes has mentioned before, there are two very important books on this subject. One of them is Willful Blindness, and the other one is Claws of the Panda, and they're both about the last 40 years of Chinese infiltration into Metro Vancouver, the business community, their real estate and property ownership, assets, all of this capital that they've been building up in this area, the fact that they are a substantial demographic in Metro Vancouver, and the fact that they have set up what are functionally police stations, most across Canada, but mostly in Vancouver, which intimidate or threaten Chinese citizens. And during the Hong Kong protests, they were also threatening Hong Kongers. They were trying to get them to go back to mainland China to face justice for protesting against the CCP government. So as much as I would prefer that if the Western provinces were going to be taken by the United States, as much as I would prefer if BC would huck it on its own as its own thing, because BC is a weird entity. BC is an oddball. BC has Eastern blood and Eastern culture, but it's located very far on the West Coast. And so this has created its own kind of unique thing. It's almost like a weird North American Singapore in many ways. They've got an interesting historic relationship with the Chinese and the Indians there, although they've always been very, very small numbers. So
yeah, and just that point, you get a lot of pushback in this space, especially in this thing of ours, when you mention anything negative about China, because people will say, "Oh, you're just falling into a neocon talking point." But I'm like, okay, I get if you're in America, you would, but there are concerns. Just again, remove ideology from it. Just look at this from pure geopolitics. If they are a great power, as Russia is a great power, maybe not on the same level as America, but there is a geopolitical game being played, and it is relevant. And like I said, the lion's share of fentanyl flowing into North America is through the West Coast, and it is from China in fucking factories that are working hand in glove with the CCP and then the triad. So like that's just a thing that's happening.
Now,
that's something.
important for any American listeners, that's different from the Sackler family controlling opioids in the pharmaceutical industry in the United States.
Sorry, Endeavour, what were you about to say there?
That's something I want to address because there's this meme that if you say anything bad about China, you must be a Zionist because you're blaming China and not blaming the Jews. It's just such a stupid TRS meme which came about because they chalk all the problems in the world up to the Jews. Now I don't deny that they are a problem, but people have to understand that there are other threats in the world, and if China is this massive country and it's gonna exert itself, and we're seeing that in Canada. It doesn't make you a Zionist or a Civnat or a neocon or whatever to point out that China is an enemy, and it's a horrible country. I mean, I just view China as its own version of dystopia. So the West is Camp of the Saints. China's 1984. I don't want Camp of the Saints, but I also don't want 1984 either. So we have to get over this idea that, and I know this isn't exactly what the stream is about, but we have to get over this idea that the entire problem is it's just the Jews. You have to view the Jews and the Zionist lobby as one entity vying for power against many other entities. It's one of the strongest ones. It's certainly the strongest one in the United States. But China's another entity, and it's something that people have to start taking seriously because they are exerting themselves in Canada. In terms of Alberta, BC and Alberta, I don't know. I mean, these provinces they just seem to be in a real bad way. Like BC seems to be the wackiest in terms of libtardism. Like I know that all, and that's
no,
not saying
it is 110%. Like the UBC and the University of Victoria are proud to produce some of the most radical student activists in all of North America. Like if I'm not mistaken, Victoria, BC has the highest number of self-identifying LGBT plus people in the entire North American continent. So
and it's so sad because Victoria, BC is actually such a beautiful city at one point, and it actually was it looked like a city from the British Isles in the New World. It's a shame to see that it's become this bastion of gayness and anti-whiteism. BC seems to be it just seems to be the wackiest. Now that's saying something when you consider Ontario. I'm not saying Ontario is sane by any stretch, but it does seem to be the worst in that regard. Alberta, I feel like Alberta kind of gets the worst of both worlds. So you get the kind of 90 IQ Americanisms of my liberty, my guns, my freedom, and stuff like this. And then because I know that Albertans are the most likely to support Canada being annexed by the United States. And then they have the worst of the Zionist lobby, so that it seems to be the strongest out there. But then they don't even. Yeah, it's the Zionist stronghold in Canada. Incredible, out in the prairies. You usually think of the Jews. You usually think of big metropolitan areas, but maybe kind of just this brand of conservatism is really just piggybacks off this brand of conservatism.
Now, I just want to say something quick.
I just want to finish though.
Sorry, continue.
Yeah, but Alberta doesn't seem to even have the positives of the controlled opposition, right? They seem to be just as woke as all the other provinces. So you have the premier of Alberta saying that she wants to double the population of Alberta in a few years, and you have her saying that Sikhs built the province, and you have her taking these photo ops surrounded by these bio-Leninist, these anti-racism HR LGBT freaks, and it's just Alberta just seems to have the worst of both worlds, the worst of the right and the worst of the left combined into one. I'm not saying this to have a go at any particular province. I'm just trying to.
It's actually true, and it's interesting you point that out because I was recently reading a political analyst paper of the politics of Alberta. So what's going on are three political power blocks. You have the cultural legacy of Anglo-Canadians, you have the cultural legacy of Anglo-Americans, and you have the cultural legacy of white ethnics. And those historically would have been Germans and Ukrainians. And what's really fascinating is that Edmonton and Calgary were set up by Anglo-Canadians. They're the centers of power. Historically, they were the seats of the Social Credit Party, which is more in line with Canadian tradition. It's more statist, it's more authoritarian. But you have the periphery, which was settled by Anglo-Americans, and they're the ones who are all about my guns and liberty and my Jesus and all of this stuff. Now, the Zionist connection in Alberta is interesting, and I believe that has to do with the evangelicalism. American-style evangelicalism is particularly prevalent in the Western provinces, and that's where that tie comes from.
Now, I know we got to get going soon. I want to just throw this grenade out there. I actually have 2 points. I didn't want to confront this with Greg because I know he tries to keep a bit of a more reasonable public-facing profile. But one thing I had been thinking of during this whole discussion was, is this restricted to whites and Europeans? Meaning, all of this talk of annexation, even the concern about annexation, do the Chinese care about that? Do the Indians care about that? Do the Mexicans care about that? Or is this really just something that's restricted to white North Americans? What do you think?
I can tell you right now that the Indians are hugely in favor of it. Every Indian that I've talked to, that I've worked with in Canada, is 110% for it, because many of them view Canada as a stepping stone to citizenship in the United States. I worked with a chick in particular who wanted to go to medical school in Canada, so that actually, constant meme, I'm not an Ontarian. It's even worse. I'm a Quebecer. So I spoke to this Indian girl, and her plan was to get a medical degree and then attempt to emigrate to the U.S. on an H-1B or whatever fast track that they get for highly skilled immigrants. So for a lot of them, it's just a secondary passport with their ultimate goal of going to the States. So they would be 100% in favor of it. Most of the Indians I talk to are pro-American annexation.
Sorry,
go ahead.
No, you guys are the stars here.
Oh, did you want to say something, Paul?
No.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I just think that I haven't really spoken to very many to see what they have to say about it. But I find that most, at least among the Jeets, they just view whatever country they're in, they just view it as an opportunity to scam a bunch of money and then send it back to India. So I don't think they would be bothered one way or another, but they probably support it because, well, it just expands the market where they can run their scams. So I mean, I'm sure they'd probably be totally in favor of it.
Now I have a proposal.
So much China, but
now here's something we can do that can create real unity between Canada and America. We do a kayfabe. We pretend that America is forcibly invading Canada militarily, and everyone gets their guns. Everyone does. We're going to do. Americans love the Civil War reenactments. Let's do an actual war reenactment, to the point where we're going to talk about doing a draft that will chase all of the Indians and probably most of the Chinese. It'll just get all, because how many people would actually fight for Canada and die for Canada? You'll probably be left with just the people who would. And maybe that's how maybe annexation is the solution to our problems. But then don't do it.
You'd be left with far-right infantry and libtard support staff. That's exactly how it would go down.
And look, that's another thing to consider here, right? I don't expect. I'm very happy that Donald Trump has been elected, and I'm very glad that there is at least some reversing of the very bad policies that are affecting this country. And there's even talk that he's kind of reversed on the H-1B question as well. Now, where was I going with this? Where I was going with this is, where was I going with it? It was going to be something with the large amount of Indians and East Asians that have entered into Canada that the government has shown no desire to deport. And that's threat number one. If those people do not leave, you will not have a Canada much longer. Or at least,
well, yes.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say yes and no. There's actually, and to your credit, I was going to say that regardless of my criticisms that I've laid out in this article of the current situation, the socioeconomics and demographics of the United States, I still think it is objectively a good thing that Donald Trump is president. I'm seeing a lot of positive signs, especially as you said, he's attempting to purge your bureaucracy. of all of these shitlibs. You can see that on the federal government workers subreddit. They're all pissing and moaning and seething about having to go back to work in person.
I remember what I was
Many of
going to
them.
say, but
Oh,
keep
go
going.
ahead. Yeah.
Well, what?
So they're
Go ahead.
okay. So they're definitely pissing and moaning. I view it as an objective good. So I just wanted to clear the air on that subject. I don't think that I'm not taking the black-pilled Devin Stack and academic agent take, which is Trump is, the regime is a monolith. Trump is in with them. Nothing's going to change. It's just going to go back to boiling the frog slowly. I don't believe that.
Yeah, I mean, and so I remember what I was going to say. If I were a Canadian and not an American, and I were looking at the situation I was looking at, a possible strategy for the Canadians is, your government. It is, I agree with you that the Canadians are a more authoritarian people than Americans, but your government reflects that. And unlike the Americans, who have no problem burning down their government, the Canadians, though they do have autonomy, have shown reluctance to do that in the past. Were I a Canadian nationalist, and my goal is long-term Canadian strength and sovereignty, it is possible that you could do what Yaki states, which is a higher being accepts temporary slavery for a time with a purpose. If I were Canada, a strategy I would very much consider is allowing the United States to annex us with a negotiated settlement, keeping as much as possible, taking as much advantage of American economic development as possible, waiting, Mr. Fortissax, you claim the United States is a declining empire. I believe that you are not correct there. I believe your clock is wrong, and I believe you think that we're at a different state of the empire than we actually are. However, you are correct, or I mean, this isn't too early as the same as being wrong, but at the same time, all empires fall, and the United States will eventually one day. And look, people misunderstand what I think and what I'm saying. Look, I'm not here. I don't believe the United States is invincible. The United States will collapse one day. It will cease to be whatever it is one day. All right. But if you're betting that Canada can outlast whatever has been created in the South, one possible strategy I would recommend, and I would consider were I a Canadian nationalist, is accepting annexation with a negotiated settlement, keeping as much Canadian autonomy as possible. And then just exploiting the United States for economic development, rebuilding a Canadian territorial military, volunteering to take up more national security tasks, et cetera, waiting for the United States to decline to such a point, and then doing what the United States did with Great Britain, declaring independence at a certain point. That's definitely something that could be done. All right. The point is, and I think the one thing that everyone agrees on, for me, and I my ideal solution to this problem, I came on to argue the pro-American side because, frankly, someone has to be the bad guy. Me personally, I want Canada to be a serious nation as much as you all do. All right. If Canada became a serious nation, do you know how many untold billions of trillions of dollars it would save my country in annexing? I don't want to annex Canada. I don't want the woes that come with territorial expansion. I don't want to have to deal with an angry Quebecois with their own language in that province. I don't want to deal with any of this. I don't want the United States to deal with any of this. All right. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. And if Canada could just do what it's done in the past, which is take itself seriously and have, but unfortunately it's going to have to be the Canadian people who do it. You all need to find a way to remove your rulers and to fix your government. And that's what it comes down to. If you all can manage to do that, I will be the first one to say, no, Canada can carry its own weight. The United States doesn't need to get involved. But until that point, this question will not go away.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I guess what I'll say is that I also do agree that it's a good thing that Donald Trump won. I totally disagree with this idea that it's just going to boil the frog slower. No, I mean, he's legitimately done some good things, like getting rid of libtards, as many libtards as you can from the bureaucracy. It just needs to be done. But I guess in terms of Canada, I just think that we can do this ourselves. I just don't think we need to be annexed by the United States in order for us to do it. And I'm actually quite confident that Canadians could actually do something similar. So, again, Trump is not going to fix the problem in the U.S. on a fundamental level, but he is going to stop the bleed. He looks like he has a possibility of stopping the bleeding. And I think that we could do this in Canada as well. I'm certainly not a fan of Poilievre or the Conservative Party or anything like that. But even within the Liberal Party, they seem to be eating crow a bit, and even they're backtracking on some of the more insane elements of their politics over the past couple of years.
Well, I mean, they fired Ramaswamy from Doge, and then all of a sudden Elon's talking about the necessity of Germany of protecting German culture. So I was quite impressed with that 180-degree turn. But so just a remark on the demographic thing with the South Asians, Paul, I wanted to mention. So as of right now, it seems that around 40 to 45% of Canadians support the mass deportation of the last 6.2 million people who entered the country over the last 4 years. And that, I'm not an accelerationist guy. I'm not somebody who believes that things necessarily getting worse red pills people or wakes them up. If you look at South Africa, there are still bleeding heart libtards who believe in Nelson Mandela's Rainbow Nation as they're getting slaughtered in the farmlands. That being said, the demographic change happened so quickly that I've had pink-haired, overweight colleagues tell me that they all have to go back, all of them. The opinion here is changing very rapidly. And what we've seen is the Liberal Party has outmaneuvered the Conservatives on the mass immigration subject. The Liberal Party, some of their members are either calling for a moratorium, their current candidates for the race, for them to be party leader in March, are either calling for a total moratorium or claiming that all illegal immigrants have to be deported, which is absolutely insane. Now, obviously, they're doing this to save their own hide. They're doing this because they know that if Canada gets annexed, they go from being a big fish in a small pond to a small fish in a very, very big pond, which they will be swallowed by with everyone else in it. So there is, I'm not on the black pill train when it comes to Canada. I don't believe that everything is over. I think that there's a lot of room for improvement and maneuvering, especially with all of the cultural forces that are currently coalescing in this country. The fact that you're even on a panel right now with 3 Canadian content creators with not unsubstantial followings is an interesting thing that wouldn't have occurred 10 or 15 years ago, or even maybe 5 years ago, perhaps. So I'm optimistic about the future in some respects in regards to the Chinese and the Indians. There seems to be massive opinion changing around that subject.
Yeah, and amongst the populace of Canada, I completely believe that the issue is that, and this is, and so here's the thing, Mr. Fortissax. All right, I see republicanism and authoritarianism within a people's bent as lending itself to different ecologies. All right, the United States has a large, the United States has downsides of its system. The United States has upsides of its system. This, as does an authoritarian ecology within Canada. The problem with an authoritarian ecology is that the government of an authoritarian system is great when it's working for you, and it's terrible when it's working against you. And right now it is working against you, and it is very difficult because there are very few commonly accepted, legally accepted, politically accepted routes for people who are not within that system to change it from the outside. Within the United States, yes, it's more prone to subversion. Yes, more interest groups, but it's also the trade-off for that is it's easier, for people to influence the course of the nation through collective and collaborative action. And so what I would recommend the Canadian people do, were I a Canadian nationalist, is find a way to perform civic participation in something that's in the United States. The United States has a very healthy and long tradition of civic participation. If you read de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, he outlines it. But the Canadians, I'm sure you have some equivalent or some way of participating in government. I would recommend heritage Canadians, be they Anglophone or Quebecois, although the Quebecois don't seem to have as much of an issue doing this. That's why their influence is so outsized. But the Anglo-Canadians more so, I would recommend that they find ways to start getting involved. I don't, whether it be local or provincial or even Canadian federal government, find ways to do it, because if the sentiment shifts, that means nothing. The sentiment shift means it's a peasant revolt. If you don't go in and you change the elites, like what the Old Glory Club is doing in the United States. The Old Glory Club, which I've helped to found, we've got chapters all across the United States now. We're looking to create elites. We're looking to create people in tune with the American heritage, in tune with the historic American people and what comes with that we can send into places of power. And I know, Red Ensign, I think is what it was called, is what, there was something that was started up there that was attempted to do something similar. That's what I would recommend. If you don't change your government, you won't change your situation.
So I'm not advocating for a peasant revolt. Let's just clear the air on that very quickly. The fundamental problem. Let's go back to where you said that the U.S. has more civic participation, as well as the difference between the authoritarian system and the democratic system. You are correct in saying that authoritarian systems work when the king is benevolent, and you're definitely right. You even see this in Europe. You see this in the UK. The UK and France are unitary states. The executive has an insane amount of power. I believe the one executive with the most amount of power within his country in the liberal democratic world is the president of France. They're effectively a presidential dictator, to be honest with you. So the downside to the American system is that, yes, you have been protected from all of these built-in mechanics that stop subversion in some respects. It also stops MAGA and anyone like-minded from permanently dealing with leftists, because those protections for all MAGA people, such as, you could say, the First Amendment, the freedom of speech and freedom from persecution from the government, that protects you. It also protects leftists who can and will continue to propagate their ideology throughout your entire society. So that's one thing. Canada's edge, actually the edge of the Europeans as well, is that if we manage to get our guys in, it's over. We can reverse all of this in a single generation, and it would be piss easy by comparison. Now, the other thing, and Dimes and I have touched on this before, is that many of the Canadian content creators are realizing that in order to have any kind of meaningful change, especially changing elites, influencing elites, or even becoming elites, you have to have first principles. You need to have an intellectual base. You need to have an intellectual foundation. Canada, in recent years, for a very long time, especially in the nationalist sphere, has not had this. Even the Freedom Convoy was very much a peasant revolt. It was a very successful peasant revolt. If we're going to use those terms, it was mostly working class guys who are more inclined to the way that we think, guys who feel, often act the way we do, but necessarily, maybe they can't put that into words. And it did it have as many positive conclusions as everybody would have liked? Perhaps not. Did it forcibly lift the COVID-19 federal lockdowns? Absolutely. It succeeded. Within a few short weeks and a couple of months after, almost all of the mandates and lockdowns on federal and provincial levels were lifted. So if there is such a thing as a successful common revolt in that way, I would say that the Freedom Convoy is that. As far as influencing elites and as far as academic agency elite theory, we're currently working on that.
All right, gentlemen, I know we need to get going soon. I'm doing the thing where I keep trying to end the stream, but we keep latching on like a dog with a soup bone. Is there any closing thoughts people wanted to get to before I do the plugs for everybody?
I guess one thing for me is that I'm actually more annoyed at Canadian quote unquote conservatives who are in favor of us being annexed by the United States than Donald Trump himself. I mean, again, the U.S. is a big, powerful country. I mean, Donald Trump, he might be an egomaniac, but I mean, he's a successful businessman and he throws his weight around. I mean, and that's to be expected. But like when it's Canadian, when it's actual Canadians who call themselves conservatives, like out there claiming that, like saying, "Oh yes, please come and save us, Daddy." I mean, that's what I find the most pathetic. That's what it has irritated me the most. But anyway, I guess it just gets back to the fact that Canada needs to be a serious country again.
All right, gentlemen, that sounds. Unless you, Paul, do you have any closing thoughts?
I mean, I'll just restate. Canada, if you do not become a serious country, annexation is the only good future that you have. That's all I have to say.
All right. Fortissax, any closing remarks there?
Revenge for 1812, Canada now, Canada forever.
All right.
No. I have more serious things. Look, if you guys check out that article that I wrote, we do have a few positive things going for us. It is very tempting in this day and age, given our situation, given our lack of political power, given our demographics, given the economy, given job opportunities, given the upwards mobility for young people. I hear you, I see you, I feel you. Do not give up.
And
Do not
also,
give up.
one
Canada lives on in all of you.
one closing remark, we're talking about this because we have the ability to talk about it. You know what? Greenland ain't talking about this. You've never seen a Greenlander. You never even heard a Greenlander. Everyone else in this conversation doesn't fucking exist. We're talking about it because we matter. You want a white pill? There you go. I'm going to go get to just some last shouts here. Paul Fahrenheidt, here we go. Founding member of the Old Glory Club. Check out the Fahrenheidt Family Archives on Substack. Endeavour at Royal Endeavour on X. Check him out on YouTube. Look him up. He's popular enough. You just type it in. He's going to come up. Classic movies with Morgoth. You got to check that out. One of the top movie shows, and there's stiff competition for that. Fortissax at Fortissax on X. Check out Fortissax's typing on Substack. You won't regret the article he had mentions on there too. And also Endeavour just dropped out, but he mentioned an article that I pulled up on screen. I'm going to be talking about this on the next episode of Blood Satellite about Trump, and we'll get into it later. But check out that article that I had pulled up during the stream. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time. I had a great time, and I hope you all did too. We got to all the chats, I believe. Yep, good stream. And we respect your work as a heel, Paul. Oh, Endeavor's just letting me know that he cut out momentarily there. He didn't just abruptly leave. So let that be known. But we're ending anyway. So